The first stone was cold. Elias knelt in the damp pit, the scent of overturned earth thick in his nostrils, and pressed his bare hands against the granite. It was flat, heavy, a slab of the mountain's bedrock wrestled from the creek a mile down the valley. He had carried it on a crude timber sledge, his muscles screaming, his breath pluming white in the late autumn air. Beside the pit, a scruffy dog with intelligent brown eyes and one floppy ear watched him, its tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against a pile of pine shavings. The dog's name was Boro. He had been Elias's father's dog, and now he was Elias's. Elias shifted the stone, grunting with the effort, until it settled perfectly level in the trench he had dug. This was the base, the first of 212 stones that would form the foundation and the floor of his cabin. But it was not a normal foundation. The pit was too deep, a full 4 feet below the frost line, and the trench he was lining snaked through the center of the rectangular footprint in a strange, serpentine pattern. It was a channel. A shadow fell over him. "What in the devil's name are you building, boy?" Elias didn't look up. He knew the voice. It belonged to Silas Croft, a man whose hands were as gnarled as the oak trees he felled, and whose opinions were as hard as the winter ground. Silas had lived in this valley for 60 years. He had built 7 cabins, buried 2 wives, and believed he understood the immutable laws of wood, stone, and snow. Elias ran a hand over the stone's surface, feeling for any wobble. It was solid. "A cabin. Looks more like you're digging a grave," Silas grunted, hooking his thumbs into his worn leather belt. He squinted at the winding trench. "That ain't how you lay a foundation. You'll have the floor heave and split your logs by January. You need piers, deep ones." "I have a plan," Elias said quietly, reaching for his tools to mix a small batch of clay and sand mortar. Boro rested his chin on his paws, his gaze fixed on Silas. "A plan?" Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Your father was a good man, Elias, but he was a reader, a dreamer, full of strange ideas from books. Looks like he passed that on to you. This valley doesn't reward strange ideas. It rewards what works. Stone piers, a heavy hearth, and a low roof. That's what works." Elias scooped the mortar onto his trowel and began to seal the edges of the first stone. He said nothing. His silence was often mistaken for slowness, but it was a quiet fortress he had built around himself after his parents were taken by the fever 2 years prior. He had learned that arguing with men like Silas was like trying to chop water. Action was the only language the valley truly respected. "You're what, 20? 21? Silas pressed on, undeterred. "You listen to your elders. Fill that fool trench in. Lay your joists on proper piers before the ground freezes solid, or you'll be living in a pile of splinters come spring." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the edge of the pit. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Silas stumped off, shaking his head. Elias watched him go, then looked down at his work. The plan was not his own. It was his father's. He had found it in a worn journal, in a section filled with drawings of Roman hypocausts and diagrams of Korean ondol heating systems. His father, a quiet scholar who had come to the mountains seeking peace, had become obsessed with the idea of capturing and storing the waste heat of a simple fire. He called it the earth lung. A stone-lined channel beneath the floor would draw smoke and hot air from the firebox, warming the mass of the stone and earth below before venting it out a chimney at the far end of the cabin. The stones, his father had written, would become a massive, gentle radiator, holding a low, steady warmth for hours, even days. It was an idea born of ancient knowledge, a theory on a page, Elias was turning it into stone and clay. Weeks turned into a month. The air grew teeth. Elias worked from the first hint of gray dawn until the last vestiges of purple light faded behind the western ridge. He hauled every stone, mixed every batch of mortar, his body hardening into a lean, efficient machine. His hands, once soft from turning pages, were now a cartographer's map of calluses, cuts, and blisters. He built the serpentine channel, lining it with flat stones mortared together so tightly a knife blade couldn't fit between them. He laid a floor of thick, smooth flagstones over the top, creating a sealed labyrinth beneath the living space. Boro was his constant shadow, a silent partner in the immense labor. One afternoon, a carriage rattled up the path. Mr. Abernathy, who owned the timber mill and half the valley, peered down from his seat, his fine wool coat a stark contrast to Elias's dirt-caked homespun. "Croft tells me you're building a new kind of cabin, son." Elias was wrestling a heavy lintel stone over what would be the hearth. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gritty forearm. "Just a cabin, sir." Abernathy eyed the low-slung foundation, the peculiar placement of the chimney flue at the far wall, away from the hearth. "He says you're running your chimney under the floor. Says it'll fill your house with smoke and burn you to the ground before the first big snow." His tone wasn't malicious, just dismissive. It was the sound of a man who had never been cold or hungry a day in his life, telling another how to survive. "It'll work," Elias said. The words were becoming his mantra. "It's your time in timber," Abernathy said with a shrug, snapping the reins. "But when you're freezing in the dark, remember there's always work at the mill for a strong back, if not a clever mind." The carriage rolled away, leaving behind the faint scent of horse and leather. The frame of the cabin rose, log by painstaking log. Elias notched them with an axe and an adze, the rhythmic chunk, chunk, chunk echoing in the quiet woods. He learned the personality of each tree, the stubborn grain of oak, the yielding softness of pine. Mrs. Gable, a kind woman whose farm bordered his land, would sometimes leave a basket at the edge of the clearing with a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, and a worried look. "Elias, dear," she said one day, catching him as he returned from the creek, "Silas is worried. Mr. Abernathy is laughing. People are talking. Are you sure you know what you're doing? A good, big hearth is what you need. Something you can huddle next to." "My father always said a man's hearth is the heart of his home." "This will be the heart," Elias said, touching the cold stones of the fireplace he had just finished building. It was smaller than a typical hearth, designed for efficiency, not grandeur. "But it's so small," she fretted. "It won't throw enough heat to warm a space this big." "It doesn't need to," he replied, his gaze distant, looking at the floor. "The heat will go where it's needed." She sighed, patting his arm. Her hands were warm and smelled of yeast. "You're a good boy, Elias. Stubborn as your father. I pray you're right." By the time the first flurries of snow danced in the air, the cabin was complete. A simple, solid structure of notched pine logs, chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and straw. A low-pitched roof designed to hold a heavy blanket of insulating snow. And beneath its floor of stone, the secret serpentine lung. He built a fire in the hearth, a small, controlled blaze of seasoned oak. He and Boro sat on the floor, watching. There was no smoke seeping through the stones. Elias laid his palm flat on the flagstones a few feet from the hearth. They were cold. He waited. An hour passed. He moved his hand to the stones in the middle of the room, still cold. Boro whined softly, nudging his master's hand. Doubt, a cold serpent, began to uncoil in Elias's stomach. Silas, Abernathy, Mrs. Gable, Their voices echoed in his mind. A fool's notion. Burn you to the ground. Pray you're right. He added more wood to the fire, a bigger blaze than the design called for. He waited again, the silence of the cabin pressing in on him. He had spent months on this, staked his survival on a dead man's theory. He crawled across the floor, pressing his cheek to the stones at the far end of the room, near the chimney vent. Nothing. Just the deep, unyielding cold of the earth. He slumped back, the weight of his labor, of the valley's mockery, crashing down on him. He had failed. He had built a beautiful, solid, cold tomb. Boro licked his face, a warm, wet tongue against his chilled skin. Elias closed his eyes, the smell of wood smoke and failure filling his senses. He must have drifted off, lulled by the crackle of the fire and the depths of his exhaustion. When he woke, it was to a strange sensation. Boro was no longer curled against his side, but was stretched out on his belly a few feet away, paws splayed, like a cat sunning itself. The fire had burned down to a deep bed of glowing embers. The air in the cabin was still chilly, but the floor was different. Elias pushed himself up onto his elbows and tentatively placed his palm flat against the stone where Boro lay. It was warm. It wasn't a hot, aggressive heat, but a deep, gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the world. He crawled across the room, pressing his hand to different stones. They were all warm. A steady, uniform heat, as comforting as a sun-baked rock in summer. The massive thermal battery of stone and earth had taken hours to absorb the energy, but now it was releasing it, slowly, inexorably. He lay flat on his back, spreading his arms and legs, and felt the gentle heat seep into his tired muscles, chasing away the chill. A slow smile spread across his face. Boro trotted over and licked his chin, his tail wagging furiously. Elias laughed, a quiet, rusty sound he hadn't made in years. It worked. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invader. It came with a wind that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oaks, and a cold that froze the creek solid to its bed. The valley hunkered down. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the other cabins in thick, desperate plumes as their inhabitants fed cords of wood into their massive, inefficient hearths. Elias kept only a small, steady fire going in his. The floor of his cabin was a constant source of gentle warmth, and the air temperature inside never dropped below 60 degrees, even when the wind howled and rattled the shutters. The snow fell, day after day, a relentless, silent siege. It piled up on his roof, just as his father's journal had predicted, becoming a thick, perfect layer of insulation. Silas passed by one morning, his face ruddy with cold, a heavy axe on his shoulder. He saw the thin, lazy wisp of smoke curling from Elias's chimney. "Having trouble keeping your fire lit, boy?" he called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "Need a real hearth for a winter like this. I'm burning through a cord a week just to keep the frost off the windows." "I'm warm enough," Elias replied, splitting logs for his modest woodpile. Each swing of the axe was clean, efficient. He was not chopping wood in a desperate race against the cold. He was simply doing a chore. "Wait until the ice winter comes," Silas warned, his smirk fading into a grim line. "We get one every 10 years or so. A cold that'll freeze the marrow in your bones and the sap in the trees. Then we'll see how your little science experiment holds up." The ice winter came 2 weeks later. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero and stayed there. The sky was a hard, brilliant, merciless blue. The snow squeaked underfoot with a sound like tearing cloth. Trees exploded in the forest, the water in their cells freezing and expanding with a sound like a rifle shot. In the valley, the battle for warmth became a full-time occupation. Log piles dwindled at an alarming rate. Inside the old cabins, the stone hearths roared, devouring wood, but their heat was a fleeting thing. It blasted the faces of those huddled near it while their backs remained cold. The far corners of the rooms were arctic. Frost climbed the interior walls. In Elias's cabin, the air was calm, and the warmth was everywhere. He and Boro moved about in simple shirt sleeves. The stones of the floor were a constant comforting presence. He would sit for hours, reading his father's journals, Boro asleep at his feet, the gentle heat rising around them. He had to break a sheet of ice in his water bucket each morning, but it was a thin skin, not the solid block his neighbors contended with. He felt a profound sense of peace, of rightness. The quiet, stubborn work had paid off. His father's dream was a warm, living reality. One evening, during the worst of the cold snap, there was a frantic pounding at his door. Elias opened it to a figure crusted in snow, his face a mask of desperation. It was Silas. "My fire," the old man rasped, his breath a cloud of vapor. "It's gone out. The wood, it's all gone. I'm freezing, boy. My hands, I can't feel my hands." He held them up. They were white and waxy. Elias said nothing. He simply stepped aside and gestured for the old man to come in. Silas stumbled past him and then stopped dead in the middle of the room. He looked around in utter disbelief. There was no roaring fire, only a bed of glowing coals in the small hearth. There was no huddling, no shivering. There was only a pervasive, even warmth that seemed to rise up from the very floorboards. He looked down at his boots, where the snow was already melting into small puddles on the warm stone. He took a hesitant step, then another. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with a dawning, shocking understanding. "How?" Silas whispered, his voice cracking. "There's no fire to speak of. How is it warm?" "The floor," Elias said simply. He led the old man to a chair and began to gently chafe his frozen hands. Boro came over and rested his head on Silas's knee, looking up with his wise, steady eyes. Silas just sat there, shaking his head, feeling the life seep back into his limbs. He looked around the simple, comfortable room. He looked at the boy he had mocked, who was now tending to him with quiet competence. He looked at the impossible warm floor. All his life he had trusted what he knew, what he could see and touch. He had trusted the big fire, the roaring hearth. He had built his life on a foundation of conventional wisdom, and that foundation had just crumbled to dust beneath his feet. "I was a fool," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "A stubborn old fool." Elias placed a mug of hot broth in the old man's hands. "You were cold," he said. "Now you are warm." The next day, Silas helped Elias bring over what was left of his food stores. He did not return to his own cabin, which he now called the icebox. He was the first. He would not be the last. The ice winter tightened its grip. The news of Silas's refuge at the Fool Boy's cabin traveled on the frozen air. 2 days later, it was the Gables. Their hearth had cracked from the intense, constant heat, and their cabin was now dangerously cold, their young daughter coughing weakly under a pile of blankets. Mrs. Gable arrived in tears, her face etched with fear and shame. "Elias," she began, her voice trembling, "I am so sorry. We laughed, Elias cut her off gently. "Bring the girl inside," he said, his eyes already on the pale child wrapped in her father's arms. "Lay her here, on the floor. It's warmest here." He and Silas made a pallet of blankets on the stones near the hearth. The little girl, Sarah, was placed upon it. Within an hour, the color began to return to her cheeks. Her shivering subsided, replaced by the deep, even breathing of sound sleep. Mrs. Gable knelt beside her, tears of relief now streaming down her face as she felt the impossible warmth of the stone beneath her knees. By the end of the week, Elias's small cabin held 12 people. The last to arrive was Mr. Abernathy. His grand house on the hill, with its 2 massive fireplaces and expensive glass windows, had failed him. The pipes had burst, encasing his kitchen in a tomb of ice. His servants had fled to their families. He arrived alone, humbled, his fine wool coat offering little protection against a cold that seeped into the soul. He stood in the doorway, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a tired, cold man. He looked at the small community huddled in the warmth. He saw Silas, his rival in all things practical, calmly whittling a piece of wood. He saw the Gables, their daughter now sitting up and sipping broth. He saw faces from all over the valley. And he saw Elias, moving quietly among them, ensuring everyone had a blanket, a share of the slowly dwindling stew. "Elias," Abernathy said, his voice hoarse, I have wood. At the mill. A whole season's worth, but no way to haul it. My horses." He trailed off. The cold had taken them too. "We'll need it," Elias said simply. He ladled a bowl of stew and handed it to the mill owner. "Eat. Get warm." Abernathy took the bowl, his hands shaking. He sat down on a crate, a man of immense wealth and power, reduced to accepting charity from the boy he had dismissed as a fool. He took a spoonful of the hot stew and felt the warmth from the floor seep into his bones. "You were right," he said, his voice barely a whisper, addressed to the room, to the cabin itself. "You were right." The cabin became an ark. By day, the able-bodied men, led by Silas, ventured out in teams to chop wood from fallen trees and hunt what little game had not frozen or fled. Elias, with his calm demeanor and deep knowledge of the land, directed their efforts. He showed them how to build better snowshoes, where to find the driest tinder, how to read the subtle signs of a coming shift in the weather. Inside, the women, led by Mrs. Gable, managed the food, tended to the children, and mended clothing. They turned a survival situation into a community. Elias's quiet authority was absolute, not because he demanded it, but because it was earned. His foresight was the reason they were alive. The cabin he had built with his own 2 hands was the heart that was keeping the valley from dying. They watched him, this quiet young man, as he tended the small, efficient fire that warmed them all. He rarely spoke, but when he did, everyone listened. He explained the principles of the earth lung, not with pride, but with the simple clarity of a teacher. He drew diagrams in the ash on the hearth for Silas and Abernathy, showing them how the heat was captured, how the stone held it, how the earth insulated it. They listened with the rapt attention of converts. They had lived their lives by one set of rules, and he had revealed another, deeper magic. It was the magic of patience, of observation, of honoring knowledge that had been forgotten. It was the magic of a son trusting his father. When the ice winter finally broke, it was like the end of a long war. The temperature rose, the sun felt warm again, and the great melt began. The refugees returned to their homes to assess the damage. The valley was scarred. Livestock had been lost, homes were damaged, and the forest was littered with fallen, frost-shattered trees. But not a single human life had been lost. They owed their lives to Elias, and they knew it. That spring, there was no mockery in the valley. There was only respect, bordering on awe. The first person to come to Elias was Silas, his hat in his gnarled hands. "Elias," the old man said, his voice rough, "my cabin, the foundation's heaved, just like I said yours would. The hearth is cracked beyond repair. I need to rebuild." He paused and took a deep breath. I was wondering if you would teach me." Elias nodded. "I'll help you." They started the next day. They dug a new foundation for Silas's cabin, a perfect mirror of Elias's own. Mr. Abernathy arrived not in a carriage, but on a workhorse, leading another laden with supplies. He brought the finest cutting tools from his mill, sacks of sand, and a promise to deliver all the stone they needed from his quarry, free of charge. "This," Abernathy said, gesturing to the serpentine trench they were digging, "this is the future of this valley. Every new cabin will have an Elias hearth. I'll see to it." And so it was. Elias, the quiet orphan, became the valley's master builder. He did not seek the role, but it was given to him. He, Silas, and Abernathy formed an unlikely trio, rebuilding the valley one warm floor at a time. They rebuilt the Gables home first, then moved on to the next family, and the next. Elias taught them the patient, meticulous work of fitting the stones, of mortaring the joints, of understanding the flow of heat and air. He shared his father's journals, and the old, forgotten knowledge spread. During that summer of rebuilding, a young woman named Lena, Mrs. Gables' niece who had come to help her family recover, began spending time at the building sites. She didn't bring food or offer worried advice. She brought her own work gloves. She learned to mix the clay mortar to the perfect consistency. She had a keen eye for finding the flattest, best-fitting stones in the creek bed. She worked alongside Elias, her presence as quiet and steady as his own. She didn't ask him about his past or praise him for his genius. She asked him why he chose a certain stone for a certain place, or how he knew the exact angle to set the flue. She was interested in the work, in the knowledge itself. They spoke little, but a deep understanding grew between them. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of Elias's cabin, watching the sunset paint the ridges, Boro resting his head on Lena's lap. She became a part of his quiet world, filling a space he didn't know was empty. They were married the following autumn, in the meadow behind the cabin, with the entire valley in attendance. Years passed. The valley thrived. The Elias hearth became the standard, a symbol of the community's resilience and shared wisdom. The harsh mountain winters were no longer a terror to be endured, but a season to be respected and prepared for. Children were born in the valley who had never known a cold floor in their lives. They grew up hearing the story of the ice winter, of the quiet boy who listened to his father and saved them all. Elias and Lena raised 2 children of their own in the small cabin. He taught them how to read the weather in the clouds, how to identify trees by their bark, and how to lay a stone so it would last for 100 years. He remained a man of few words, his actions his testament. He never boasted, never spoke of the time the valley had doubted him. He simply continued to build, to teach, and to live a quiet life of purpose. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slower. He spent most of his days sleeping on the warm stones by the fire, the same stones he had been the first to test so many years ago. One winter morning, Elias woke to find the old dog had passed peacefully in his sleep. His body was still warm from the floor beneath him. Elias carried him outside and buried him beneath the tall pine tree that overlooked the cabin. He carved a simple stone marker, Boro, a good and faithful friend. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the cold stone, a silent farewell to his first and most loyal believer. Decades rolled by like the seasons. Elias's hair turned the color of snow. His hands, though gnarled with age, were still steady. He became the elder now, the Silas of his generation, though his wisdom was sought, not offered unsolicited. He would sit on his porch with Lena, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and see the thin, efficient plumes of smoke rising from 24 chimneys across the valley, each one a testament to his legacy. He saw that the knowledge had been passed on. It was safe. When his time came, it was as peaceful as Boros. He died in his own bed, in the warm, solid cabin he had built, with Lena holding his hand. The entire valley mourned him. They buried him on the small rise next to Boro, under the shade of the great pine. Silas's grandson, a master stone carver, chiseled the epitaph into a large, smooth slab of creek granite. It did not speak of his fame or his deeds. It said simply, "Elias. He kept us warm." Long after the names of the people were forgotten, the cabins remained. They stood against the wind and the snow, their foundations solid, their hearths breathing low, steady warmth. Travelers passing through the valley in the dead of winter would marvel at the sight of the small, sturdy homes, each with a thin, lazy wisp of smoke rising into the cold, clear air. They would wonder at the quiet genius of the people who had learned to live in harmony with the harsh land, who had discovered the secret of capturing the fire and making the very earth their ally. They would see the smoke, and they would know that in this valley the people were safe, and the people were warm.